Did you know growing up that there are biblically justifiable reasons not to listen to your parents? Those extend to your government
Are you
too.
ready? It's that time.
So with that cold open, you managed to make sure parents are never going to give this for their kids to listen to. We lost anyone who was a big fan of listening to the government, and then the theme song we lost some. We just lost like a bunch of potential subscribers, all in like 2 minutes, not even a minute, 55 seconds, and now I lost Ben. Oh,
You're
he's
welcome. I'm gonna send this to Zeke when he's about 10 years old.
I will teach him that there are justifiable reasons for him to not listen to me. He just better be careful when he employs said reasons.
That's fair. That's fair. Anyway, so the reason that I opened our show this way is that he talks about parenthood and government in more or less the same breath. Basically, the idea is like the government is an extension of parental duties to kind of keep people in line and help them to grow in the ways that they should go. And today, our topic from the Book of Concord is circling back to that idea, but focusing especially on how Christians interact with government. And I think that's especially pressing with this year being an election year, with all the conversations that have been had around what good governance looks like. There's that new law in Texas about teaching the Bible in public schools. There's all sorts of reasons that this is relevant for us today and now. But I also
think it's appropriate for this episode to kick it off with a few disclaimers for all of you who are listening.
yeah,
First, I would suspect over the course of this episode, there are going to be things that come out that are more Ben and my opinion on the state of the world. And so, and we'll try to distinguish those when they come out. That's not biblical truth. That's not theological truth. It's maybe informed by those things, but we are allowed to have opinions, and we do have opinions, in fact, about some things. We're incredibly apathetic about other things. What we want to assure you is if you have different opinions than us on these things that are they're just our opinions, we, I think, are both professional enough. Even if we were to know you have different opinions, that's fine. We'll still be pastors to you. We still love you guys. So don't think that because you view things differently than us that we're not gonna care about you as much. We're not gonna be your pastors. Something like that. That's just silly. And another disclaimer, and this is just for me, I don't watch the news. And ever since I turned the TVs off in the gym, which was a great move by the leasing office, by the way, I'm a big fan. It's much less distracting for my workouts. I don't even really see headlines. So Ben mentions this new law in Texas, and I have no idea what he's talking about. And you know what, ladies and gentlemen, I'm okay with that. I am okay with my ignorance. So, dilly. Those are the disclaimers I thought were maybe relevant to this episode.
Yeah, and I feel like we could go on with kind of endless disclaimers. Anytime that politics and religion are involved, there are so many like instant death buttons that we can just step on.
We don't get canceled.
Yeah, exactly. It's also worth noting that both of us have at least shoulder length hair, and Josh is wearing a bro tank. Let that be the level of expertise that you are seeking on all of these things as we engage in this conversation. I mean, we know what we're talking about when it comes to the theological side of things. We have an idea of what we're talking about when it comes to how it
let's not
interacts
discount
with.
our opinions too much, right?
Yeah.
Both Ben and I have master's degrees in theology.
Yeah.
Now, they're vocational masters, which no one
Josh
cares
almost
about
has an
at
ed.
school. Yeah,
Josh almost has an Ed.D. So
yeah, I'm less than a year away from a doctorate. I just finished my 3rd chapter recently.
There you go.
And it's out of 5 chapters, so
nice.
I'm excited. But
Anyway, we kind of know what we're talking about, but also take it with a grain of salt.
yeah, take anything that's not biblical or theology with a grain of salt.
And if you have questions about it, don't just stew on it. Come talk to us about them. Because, like, if you're right, we want to know where we were wrong. And if you're wrong, well,
we don't tell you.
Yeah. Josh and I really like being smug and right.
What? I resemble that remark. So getting into this article, kind of to summarize, and we could read it, but we're probably not going to.
Article 16.
Article 16, this is of the Augsburg Confession.
Yeah.
Essentially, it says, and this is what it starts with, it's taught that all political authority, this government, laws, good order in the world, are created and instituted by God. Okay, so, and this is leveraging something that is taught in the New Testament, that no authority is in place if God hasn't allowed it to be there.
Yeah.
Goes on to say that Christians can engage with politics. So Christians may, without sin, exercise political authority, be princes, judges, punish evildoers with a sword, wage just wars, service soldiers, possess property, take required oaths, be married, etc. So it's saying you can get involved with the things of secular order. And then it goes on to say that the gospel, and this is lowercase gospel, so this is more generally the message of Christianity, it doesn't overthrow secular government, public order, and intends instead that we uphold these things. And then the last, and this is what Ben alluded to in the cold open, the very last point that it makes in this article is, if a command of political authority cannot be followed without sin, one must obey God rather than human beings. And that's where a lot of discussion, I think, needs to happen and does happen in Christianity, of how far, like, when do we start saying, well, we're not doing this without sin? Okay, so Ben looked like he wanted to jump in with a point, but I don't know if I've lost him or not.
Two things. One, on that last point, the inverse is also true. So if a command cannot be kept without sin, don't keep it. But on the flip side, if a command does not force you to sin, if it does not coerce you to sin, keep it. You don't have to like it, but keep it. Okay, that's one. And then two, the other thing that I wanted to point out, as Josh was talking about the first piece of what this article brings up, that is that secular government was created and instituted by God. That doesn't mean what sometimes comes up in more evangelical circles and kind of bleeds into our theology from time to time, that these positions are like by divine right. That just doesn't exist.
And I think you have to acknowledge that even God has a reason for everyone being where they are.
Yeah.
But that doesn't remove the reality of sinful, broken creation.
Yeah.
And like, you can look at extreme examples, like the regime of Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, probably also, like, you can point to leaders and say, I'm sure God used them to accomplish something. Like, God's plan wasn't thrown completely off track by this leader. But you can also say, okay, that person was not ruling in a just and righteous way.
Mhm.
And you can get to closer examples where you can say, like you can look at things that political leaders do and say, God has them there for a reason. However, they are not ruling in a way that is pleasing in His sight. And to apply that kind of to the American democracy, you can say that with elections. You can say, well, God's going to make sure the right person is in charge. That doesn't mean that the majority of the American population can't go astray and can't vote a certain way for sinful reasons. So while this is, it's kind of, I think it's worth taking a balanced, moderate approach, saying no ruler is in place without being part of God's plan. However, there is also sin involved with it, whether it's from the leader, from whoever put them in place, or even just with how they're carrying out their authority. Like, sin is unfortunately part of our reality until Jesus comes back.
A good parallel here. We agree. I think everyone who's listening to this will hopefully mostly agree that there are pastors in the church for a reason. This position that God has given us to, one, proclaim forgiveness, but two, also kind of help keep good order. And you try to place people in that position who are good at that position and who are good fits for that position. We just talked about that a couple episodes ago. And I feel like the same logic should apply to positions of political authority. If God instituted secular order for the sake of good order and peace, and hopefully the prosperity of the people living in that peace, you would hope then that they also, like the people who are placed in those positions, to the best of their abilities, embody those characteristics. And if they don't, just like you would with a bad pastor who is heretical or unfaithful or, wantonly and committing egregious sins, it's okay to be done with the man or the woman that's leading in that particular way.
And conveniently in the American system, we have regular opportunities to remove people from office.
But that also brings us back to something that we talked about before we started, which is as we think about how we voice our displeasure with things that are going wrong, whether it's a particular leader or if it's something that's happening under that leader's authority, how we do things. And that got Josh and I thinking. We're recording this on July 8th. So we just missed 4th of July. Boy, would this have been a banger to come out on the 2nd of July. But was what the colonists did in the 1770s justified as an act of rebellion against a God-instituted position of authority, but a king who was...
Which touches on two of these different things. In the first, Christians may without sin exercise political. So if you are a Christian and you run for office, like if you're a member of my congregation and you're running for office, I think you have to be careful with that. Because there is nothing inherently wrong, but it drags you close to a lot of frankly sinful things with how politicians of both parties tend to talk about each other. Right there you have, well, this isn't building one another up. You have, whether you like it or not, I think this is an indisputable fact. The American political system is rife with corruption. There are countries that are worse, there are countries that are better, but it exists, and that's something you have to be careful of. And you also, something that I'm more, if you're coming to me as a pastor and you're saying, well, I'm running for this office, what I'm more concerned about is, for a lot of politicians, it seems to me that the faith becomes just part of the public image, and it's less of a genuine concern for discipleship. So if you come to me and you say, I'm thinking of running for political office, I'm going to say, okay, we probably need to have a very frank and serious conversation about how you're going to maintain your discipleship, even through this path that is laid out ahead of you. And so a lot of the rest of these I don't think are very controversial in today's time. Like, be judges, administer just, like, if a judge says they're Christian, no one's like, you can't do those things, both those things. Punish evildoers with the sword. This is kind of, we are okay with punishment. Now the sword is a euphemism. I don't, synecdoche.
It's a symbol. It's a symbol of
it's
God's
saying
authority.
you can execute punishment, whether
Yes.
that is incarceration or community service, or up to and including the death penalty. Wage just wars. This is kind of what Ben is talking. This is from a leadership position. How are you deciding to go to war? And is that reason just and faithful? This is one of the places where I think the separation of church and state idea breaks down, because the church in its faithful role should inform that decision. You're like, oh, I'm considering going to war with this country. The church should say, well, what are your reasons, and kind of help you evaluate those. Service soldiers, that's a distinct thing. This doesn't necessarily put someone who has boots on the ground in a position to say, you know what, I'm going to leave because I don't believe this is just war anymore. Buy and sell, take required oaths. I think there aren't a ton of people who have issues with those. But then it also says the gospel doesn't overthrow secular government, public order, and marriage, but instead intends to keep this as the order of God. Which all brings us to the question, the Revolutionary War, was it a faithful thing? Was it an okay thing for the Christians? And most of the colonists were Christians to one degree or another. Was it
A lot of them came here seeking independence, or seeking some level of independence for the sake of religious freedom, right? You have the Puritans, you get the Quakers, you've got Dutch Protestants living in Pennsylvania, you've got French Huguenots that were fleeing Catholic oppression, you've got Lutherans start showing up pretty quick because they don't like this the unionism. There's a term that some of you may recognize where Lutheran theology and Reformed theology were kind of getting mushed together and turned into some unholy oddball child. Anyway, in all of this, Christianity and theological conversation was a big part of the formation of the colonies. But did that kind of conversation and thoughtfulness then also apply to the way that the United States went about its independence? That gets to be, I think, a little bit more interesting conversation, right? Because what's the big event that all of us kind of get typically taught as the match that lit the fire that was the American Revolution, Josh?
Are you talking about the Boston Tea Party or the, now I forget the name of it. There was a tax act. There's a specific tax act that they were like, okay, this is it. We're done. They were taxing...
it was a tea tax.
It was a tea tax, and there was also tax on a couple other things, and it was just exorbitant. Which is crazy because we pay so many more taxes than that today. I'm going to look up what the tea tax rate was because it's going to make us all mad.
Yeah, it was not that high. But it was still considerably higher than the tea tax rate that people in Britain were having to pay, which was part of the problem. That and tea did not reach the United States until after it had already been to Great Britain. So all the good tea had been sifted through at that point. And so the United States got crappy tea, and they were like, why should we have to pay tax on crappy tea? And I think that's why the United States is currently dominated by the political structure that is Starbucks and Dunkin' Donuts as its political overlords. Honestly, remove coffee and caffeine from the United States for a week, and I think we'd disintegrate. Josh, you find that yet?
Yeah, it's oh jeez. It was 3 cents per pound of tea. But
Okay.
digging just a little deeper, and if you're a historian or an expert in this, you can tell me I'm wrong and I'll accept it because this was 2 quick Google searches. It would have probably been less than a couple percent. It might have even been less than a single percent on the cost of
What were they paying for a pound of tea?
tea. Well,
These are the real hard-hitting questions that we want to answer on our theological podcast.
uh, well, they destroyed a whole lot of money worth of tea.
What were they paying per pound of tea?
Um, oh, it just has the flat. It would be a 8% tax, actually.
Okay.
Which
8%.
in most places in America,
That's sales
the
tax.
tax for most things, the sales tax is set. I think 7 point something%, and then you get added on a lot of places like a state tax or what. So,
Yeah.
especially in California, the tax on our gasoline is way higher than that. So,
Yeah. I think most sales taxes in the United States fall between 6 and 10% these days, so that's basically par for the course at this point.
yeah, and if you take into account the fact that income is already taxed, and like you have all these other taxes that you don't pay at the register, but you're still paying, like the American Revolution was fought over much lower taxes than we currently pay.
Yes. But also, from my memory, and somebody can fact check me on this, a lot of U.S. shipping, so shipping that was done by companies that were based in the colonies, were running on extraordinarily thin margins, because there just wasn't a ton of money already in the colonies, and a whole lot of other things kind of piled into that. But it meant, an 8% tax on tea, while not seeming that huge to us today, would have been a big deal for them back then.
Well, and the conversion rate was like the currency conversion rate. 3 pounds would have been around $10. So Americans today might be used to a lot of other countries you go to. The American dollar is stronger, so like your money goes further. It was very much the reverse. So the tax hurt them, but it kind of begs the question: well, is paying taxes something worth? And there were other factors, right? There were issues of representation. They didn't love some of the religious stuff that England was trying to kind of push over. Like we're aware that no one declares war for just one reason.
Yeah.
Um,
And then the resulting crackdowns from British military on American property owners or colony property owners and businesses.
yeah. If you want a more comprehensive list of reasons for the Revolutionary War, look at the Bill of Rights.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the amendments in the Bill of Rights are a direct response to this is stuff we had to deal with from the British that we don't want to deal with anymore. So stuff like forced quartering of troops is included in there. Freedom of religion, freedom of like these basic freedoms that we kind of take for granted. It was a response to, at the time, they didn't necessarily have those freedoms guaranteed.
Yeah.
So, and it kind of like I don't think, let me say this first. I don't think a revolution is practical or feasible today. For no other reason than military armaments. Like people say, oh, a militia. No, militia, what? What are you talking about? The U.S. military has tanks, period. That's like, period. They have tanks. I can't get a tank. There is no state that I'm aware of that you can get a tank with an active gun. You can get like a retired one, I think. I've seen YouTube videos where people buy retired tanks and like the cannon isn't operational anymore. So let me throw that out. But there is, and you can see this anytime you watch the news, there is a freedom in this country to protest, to assemble, to in different ways, maybe not rebel, but kind of rebel against the government. And the question is, when is that appropriate? When can we start talking about tearing it all down? And as we're talking about this last one, if a command of the political authority cannot be followed without sin, when we apply our broader understanding of what sin is, I think that really broadens, well, how comfortable do we get with the government? Because even if you take, I'm going to use an example from the state of California. I don't know how long ago this was, I think before my time. But a ton of money was set aside by the state government to help combat homelessness, which is a huge issue in California. And it kind of more or less just disappeared. Like, no one really knows where the money went. Well, someone does, but the public does not know where the money went. And you say, well, that's unfortunate. Call it incompetence or whatever, but are they... Would you rebel against that? Because, where does the sin come in? And I said, well, the sin comes in because we are called to do what is best for our neighbor and to be good stewards of our resources. So if you are in an instance where there's a gross mismanagement of funds that are supposed to be for the good of the neighbor, I would say, yeah, that's like, it is sinful that money was mismanaged. And I think that is putting the best construction on it to call it mismanaged. But, and if you look federally, like, there are a lot of instances where you can say maybe they're not forcing you into sin, but the way that we are handling ourselves as a country is sinful. And it is appropriate to say, and here's the crazy part, is to say, well, there needs to be a change. And I've already said I don't believe a revolution is feasible, and I'm not advocating for a revolution. But in some ways, kind of a more, not a military revolution, but a revolution in who we put into office. Because and I don't care who you are, frankly, both options that at the time of this podcast, it is still Biden and Trump, is looking at the next presidential election. And I don't care who you are, frankly, neither option is great from a Christian perspective. And this is where we step into my personal opinion. In my personal opinion, on one hand, you have a guy who is morally, I don't want to say bankrupt, but he's not doing great. He's morally cash poor. And on the other side, you have someone who is pretty frankly incompetent. So, neither of those is a great choice, because both of those lead us to a place where we are not doing what is best for our neighbors. Mm-hmm. Whether that is by the example that's being set from the top, or whether that is how resources are being leveraged for the sake of people in this country. So and I've made this joke before. Let's just find Dave the mechanic. Dave the mechanic, some random guy who treats his customers well, a family comes in and their van is broken down, but they're short on cash. He's like, you know what? I'm just going to fix it. I'm just going to take care of you. And this guy who's just a genuinely good guy, he's honest, he's a straight shooter, he does what needs to be done. Let's find Dave the mechanic and elect Dave. What a guy. And then we apologize to Dave for doing that to him. But so I think we have reached a point in American history where some sort of revolution is probably warranted from a Christian perspective. But I don't think that takes the place of a military revolution. I think that takes the place of Christians saying, we're tired of compromising on our values for one candidate or the other. Can we just get a person who is good, who is genuinely good? I don't know if that's possible, but that's what I'm dreaming for.
Yeah. I mean, circling back to your whole point about like the way that government exists in our country today, it just seems like such an uphill battle to find somebody who's not morally bankrupt. Um, and like, I don't know about you, Josh, but it frustrates me like that so many people in politics leverage the idea of faith and Christian morals to support their platform, both sides of the aisle. This is not, me indicting one party or the other, or even third parties. Um, but it's just sad that no one actually within their circle, the circle of someone who refers to themselves as a Christian, is willing to stand up and say, you know what, I don't know if this is actually Christian principles. Um, you
Yeah,
need to do
it's
better.
as a Christian, and this again, this is speaking for me individually, but I think this is consistent with our theology. I do not feel like I am actually represented by any of my so-called representatives.
And it's not just because he lives in California. He
Yeah.
probably felt the same way in Georgia and Missouri.
The local representatives in Georgia were really good. Like the Warner Robins, while I was there, like I knew the mayor's daughter, and they were a Christian fit. They went to church regularly. They genuinely did their best to live out their faith. So, and I'll give that credit. I suspect there are a lot of smaller scale local governments where that is the case.
Oh yeah, for sure.
But especially, I think probably once you get to state level, it's difficult. I don't want to say impossible because again, I'm sure in some of the smaller states there is a more genuine representation of faith. But so I don't want to speak with absolutes. But
I mean, I had a high school friend. I went to a Lutheran high school in the Twin Cities. I had a high school friend whose dad ran for, I think, state congressional office of some kind. And he ran a pretty upstanding, clean campaign in terms of like not trying to just belittle the crap out of his opponent, but just speaking honestly to his thoughts on the situation and the job that his opponent had done. And he got walloped just because he was a decent guy, and like that was kind of like looking back at it, I feel like that should have been more of a signal to me that like, hey, politics are just shooting fish in the barrel in terms of who you want as your representative. That's probably not going to represent you that well. But I agree. Like when you get to a more local level, you have more ability to speak to the people that are in authority, to know them on a more personal level, and perhaps if they are Christian, hold them to their faith and to their beliefs.
yeah, and that is, I think there's a strong argument to be made for smaller government, for saying we should more focus, like we
on
should
the
reduce the
accountability level
federal.
for sure.
Yeah, we should reduce these bigger levels because they're so out of. They don't see the impact of their decisions nearly as much.
Yeah.
Which is just the nature. But I mean, the reality is, people do not give up power. So I know there are a couple of senators who are always like proposing term limits, like in Congress, and it's like Congress is never going to vote itself a term, especially when that term limit would mean that it was the last term for like
2/3 of Congress and 2/3 of the Senate.
Over half of they're not going to say yes. I am going to vote myself out of a job today. Like what? Who would do that?
Yeah. I'm with you. And like it's
But to be a voice of
telling of so many things.
What this article says is like, as a Christian, you can you can engage with this. for Christians, what I would encourage you is start by looking at Scripture and looking at faithful theological teaching, and let those form your political opinion. And this is a trend, you can see it in research all over the place. People tend to pick the church based on their political opinions. They let their political opinions influence their religion. They don't let their religion influence their political opinions. First of all, reverse that. Start with your faith and say, okay, now how do I interact politically? How do I think politically based on my faith? And if you have an opinion that you're willing to fight for, and you can't justify it to me biblically, theologically, maybe you need to calm down. But from there, you say, okay, I'm going to engage, because that's, I think, how we start to fix things is people say, I am willing to have these conversations. I'm willing to talk to people, not in an aggressive way, not in an argumentative way, just in a genuine way about politics, formed and informed by my faith, first and foremost. And you start having those conversations, and those conversations build. And then maybe in a generation or two, we actually see change that is worthwhile.
I want to kind of wrap up our conversation today by circling to a lot of what drove this article to be written. And it was mostly to do with the church trying to exert, we'll say, too much authority over local kings and lords in Luther's time. The church was a major player politically.
You have to keep in mind, when Luther was writing this, it was the Holy Roman Empire, and the Pope had probably more authority than the Emperor did.
Yeah.
The Emperor had to get approval from the Pope
to do a lot of things. Yeah.
No, I mean for his coronation or whatever.
Oh yeah, that too.
An emperor couldn't be elevated to power without the blessing of the church.
Yeah. And even in places that weren't the Holy Roman Empire, like places that were supposed to be the protectorate of the Vatican and Rome, they were still often beholden to the Catholic Church's authority for a variety of reasons. And that's why, that's a big part of why the Church of England exists. Because Henry VIII wanted to get divorced, or he wanted his marriage annulled, more accurately. His wife, a faithful Catholic, and I still think in the right in this situation, refused on the grounds that, well, they had consummated their marriage, and so they weren't eligible for an annulment. Henry VIII didn't want to hear it, but the Catholic Church had so much sway that he couldn't do anything about it. He couldn't name any of his illegitimate children as an heir because it was against Catholic Church teaching. He couldn't annul his marriage even though he wanted to, because it was against Catholic Church teaching.
But he started his own church.
So he started his own
church.
Not
a great reason to start. Well, and even if you look at the roots of the Lutheran Church, the reason, or one of the reasons Luther got so much support from the German princes was because they were tired of answering to Rome, and they saw it as an opportunity to loosen Roman authority over them.
And especially taxes. We talked about it with the United States, but the German princes were basically the coin purse for a lot of the spectacular churches you see throughout Italy and especially in Rome. Because the industry in Germany was good, and the church could leverage their power to get them to pay for things. When they figured that out, they just kept exploiting that as much as they could until the princes got sick of it, and they were like, you know what? We like this Luther guy.
Screw you guys! I'm going home.
Exactly. And there were so many goofy, power-hungry loopholes that the church used to exert its influence, that I think it should be no surprise to us that things played out the way that they did with Luther. And so, like, this particular article is really trying to just say, hey, the church is called to be the church. Secular authorities are called to be secular authorities. They're each given their own position. The church to bring forgiveness and proclaim the gospel. Secular authorities to carry the sword or institute God's judgment and justice.
And to keep order.
And to keep order. And the two shouldn't necessarily be overlapped, apart from the fact that they were both instituted to care for the creation that God had given them to be in.
Yeah. And
right?
There should be a mutual respect there. There should be some influence there.
Yeah.
But they hold different roles, and they should be kept there.
Yeah. And so, like, when we think about separation of church and state, it's like Josh said, it's not that we don't want to carry our faith and our understanding of how God created this place, the world, to function. It's not that we shouldn't carry those things into our ideas of politics and the ways that we want to see our nation and our communities governed. But it's that we should want the church to exist for the function of the church, right? The church should exist to bring comfort to sinners and care for souls. It shouldn't exist to decide local tax rates.
No.
We want our governments to exist to provide good order and to make sure that people in our communities are safe and cared for. That there is a sense of security and peace in the land. And we don't want them telling us what precisely theological or what precise theological truths we are meant to hold to, because that's not what their gifting is. They're not trained theologians for the most part. Some of them have reverend in their title, and I significantly doubt that they would have passed Concordia Seminary.
Okay, but that's true of a lot of people who have reverend more legitimately as well.
That's fair.
There are a lot of people out there who call themselves pastors who never would have made it through the program that you and I did.
That's fair. All of that is to say, let's let the church do the things of the church. Let's let the government do the things of the government. And let's try to uphold them both and do them both as faithfully as possible.
Yeah. And because most of the people who are listening to this podcast, in fact, I would dare say all of the people listening to this podcast are not governmental authorities. If you are listening to this and you're in government, great, cool, glad you stopped by. But for most of us, I think when we ask, well, should this actually impact? And it's the same thing as so many others. Start with your faith. Like, start there. Start by saying, what does my faith say about these things? What does my faith say about different political issues? What does my faith say? Start there. Don't start with what you feel. Don't start with what what your political preference is. Don't start with yourself. Start with, well, what does God have to say about it? Because so often we start in another place, and then after the fact, we look to God to see if we can leverage some sort of justification out of it.
Mm-hmm.
Start with the faith.
Should we move to some takeaways?
Yeah, we should move to some takeaways.
You can go first, or do you want me to?
You can go first. That way I can kind of consolidate my thoughts.
Sure. So I think my overall takeaway from this my overall takeaway that I hope you take from this is kind of a thread traced through all of it. And that is, way too often we put too much faith and hope in human institutions. Whether it's our our local government or our church denominational structure, all of them are still ultimately human institutions. And they're only going to function to a certain extent because they're full of sinful people. And so we have to respond to them with as much, faithful conversation and communication as we can, and not just give up on them and say, "Oh, I guess this is the best we got because they're all sinners anyway." Do what you can to encourage them to be more faithful, but also do that in a Christian way. And know that ultimately, even if these things crumble, Jesus is still the Lord of the church.
I think my takeaway closely follows on the heels of Ben's. And that is, be uncompromisingly faithful to God. Obey God. Whether that is in how you vote, how you interact politically, the conversations you have. Let the things of God drive your thoughts, your words, and your deeds. And that shouldn't be a radical statement for Christians, but for some of us, it is. And none of us will be able to do that perfectly. That's going to be a struggle because we are broken sinners just like everybody else. But I think most of us could probably try a little harder to be uncompromisingly faithful and obedient. So we hope this episode was more enlightening and helpful than it was offensive and soapboxy. It is our goal to just bring you closer to the things of faith, not for anything else. So hopefully this has done that. This has been a production of Man Buns and Jesus. You can follow us on whatever your favorite podcasting platform is. We are on all of them. You can go ahead and give us a like or a rating. We appreciate those. They help us out with the algorithms. And if you have questions, especially with this episode, if you have questions or comments, please reach out to us, whether that is in the comments or reaching out to us and texting us or through our Facebook page. We'll get back to you regardless. It's been our joy. It's been our pleasure. So with all of that being said, brothers and sisters, go in peace and serve the Lord.
Thanks be to God.